Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. This is Secular Bible Study Series, and we are finally starting the New Testament. Welcome to episode 40. We are starting with Matthew. I did decide to go in canon order and not chronological order. We'll talk about that here in a second. I want to explain my thought process and what my goal is for this series as it continues. So if you're just here to hear about Matthew, you can just skip to the timestamp down below. But if you're curious on what this is going to look like as we move through the next 27 books and episodes, I'd encourage you to take a couple minutes to hear me out. The goal of secular Bible study, let's just restate it. Why did I do this in the first place? It's because I believe there is a Christian understanding of the Bible through a bias, through a lens of this religion is true. So the purpose of secular Bible study series is to look at this religion for what it is. Mythology, just another book making more spiritual and supernatural claims. So what are the objective facts that we can get? There's a lot we can't know. There's a lot we have to speculate on, but what do we know about the authorship? What do we know about the dating? What do we know about the historical context? Can we make a literary analysis? Can we still talk about what the main themes to be pulled are? What has been its influence and reception both in the past and even now? And what are the problems that we do know about? Are there contradictions? Are there errors? I want to give you a very high level, but still interesting and unique and informative and educational and hopefully even entertaining look at these books. We're going to give some special attention in today's video to the Gospels. We need to talk about the setting. We need to talk about the Second Temple period. We need to talk about the chronological order. We need to talk about the anonymous natures of the Gospels. We have some work to do, so let's dive right in. I think the first thing to understand is it's been somewhere between 400 and 500 years since we left the Old Testament behind. And this period of centuries is known as the intertestamental period or the Second Temple period. Then you have Jesus arrive on the scene, you have his death, and then 35 to 40 years later, you get the first gospel account that made it into the canon, and that is Mark. So that's CE 65 to 70 roughly, and then next would be Matthew, which is around years 70 to 85, generally speaking. Again, there's going to be some question marks and some margin of error for each of these. There are vast differences between what you get about the life and teaching and personality of Jesus in these different gospels. You'll see that a lot as we get to point 7, where we are covering contradictions. And by the way, we are maintaining the same 7 points to go through. Again, we've got some introductory work that needs to be done for this episode. So what has happened in the last 400 years since we left the Old Testament behind? It's important to understand all the times that these people have been ruled. You know, we talked a lot about the Babylonian exile, and it changed things significantly for the believers of this religion. It's also when they started to amalgamate and combine and collect all of their written and oral materials. In essence, it's kind of when the Bible as we think about it, or at least most of the Old Testament, is compiled and created. But then you have what follows after those people get home, and things don't match up to the lore and the majesty that was described by their ancestors. It's real everyday life, and yes, they still get their prophets and they still look for meaning, but the presence of God is vastly different and far removed. Now extrapolate that for another 400 years. Prophets coming and going, people reading and reinterpreting these different books and collections of messages. Everyone always awaiting a messianic figure to come and fulfill supposed prophecy, which many did. Many before Jesus, many at the same time as Jesus, and many after Jesus. And because of this, you get some different break-off and sects within Judaism in and of itself. I mean, we see that even in the New Testament Gospels when we see the difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes. And there are many other groups that were splintering and differing over different understandings of the teaching of the law and the expectation of what a messianic figure would look like or when he would be coming, etc. On top of that, you add into the mix things like Greek and Roman rule. We saw the influence from the Persians during the Babylonian exile, and now we see Greco-Roman influence like crazy in the New Testament, which of course, I mean, even the original language of the New Testament is Greek. That's going to change things. We have to understand the other myths and stories that were floating around at that time, the other philosophies that were at play. You can't help it as a culture when you're taken over as another culture to have influence spread, to have stories combined and ideologies and philosophies mixed and evolving. And for anyone that has really studied the Old Testament Testament. It's so clear because it has to be this huge reframe to make Jesus fit. What was predicted in the Old Testament, if we can even say that these kinds of things were predicted, because most of the time what counts as Old Testament prophecy pointing towards Jesus is pointing towards something very specific at that time. But insofar as we can say, okay, yep, they are talking about a future king to come, Jesus meets so little of those qualifications that, of course, the spiritual leadership at the time didn't accept Jesus. He didn't match up with Scripture, which is what we are supposed to test against. And when you really understand that, and then you see these gospel accounts and how hard they're trying, this is an agenda to, after the fact, fit Jesus into the role of the future messianic king, you can begin to quite clearly see that these should not be linked, but that through one Jewish subcult that got popular, thanks again to the Romans, not the truth value of it, we have ever since been finding ways to make connections where there were none. And that's where we get all kinds of shifts and differences and what I believe to be mutually exclusive understandings and impossibilities between the Old and New Testament, from law to grace, from God's 10 Commandments to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. It is almost night and day. It is almost as different as you can get. And to act like there is any kind of unity here is just a testament to the creative nature of humankind. So, with a very limited stage setting, let's move on to point 1, book overview, and break down the 28 chapters of Matthew. Chapters 1 and 2 are immensely important to the gospel writer who's putting this together. I'm going to refer to Matthew as Matthew, even though Matthew is an anonymous book that had Matthew's name tied to it to make it significant. Just for sake of ease, when I say Matthew, you know what I mean. But this first section, chapters 1 and 2, so important because they are building their case for why Jesus is the Messiah that was predicted. So it starts off with genealogies, because how did you make anything legitimate at this time? And in the examples that we get from the Old Testament, the line of kings. We need to see him descended from David. We need to see him going all the way back to Abraham. And so that's what we see. Again, there are some contradictions there. Stick around for point 7. Equally important in this first grouping is chapter 2, where we get the birth narrative. We have to have Jesus coming from the right place at the right time in the right way. And in this case, in Matthew, from a virgin, to fulfill what they thought were Old Testament prophecies. The second grouping I would put together are chapters 3 through 7, which is really going to be about the early teachings of Jesus. This is where we get accounts of his baptism and the temptations in the wilderness. And it's so hard, guys. Again, on this first one, please bear with me because I want to just explain everything out loud. You know, I look at something like Matthew 7, and it's like, I want to spend an hour talking about Jesus's concept of judging others. It's fascinating. I want to talk about the history of the Golden Rule and where we've seen this elsewhere that even predates Jesus and how it can clearly be improved on. I want to talk about in verse 21 where Jesus says people will think that they are saved, that they know this God, just to find out that they didn't. The implications of that are humongous. So again, I'm going to try my best to get through it as we go through, and especially during 7 with contradictions and problematic passages. And as we start comparing what is said in one gospel versus another, this is just point 1. This is just book overview, but it is so hard for me. And I hope that you just understand what the end goal is here. I mean, I'm looking at it right here. Chapter 6, the Lord's Prayer. That deserves an hour-long breakdown. It's so hard. But you know what's exciting? Just like as we went through the books of the Old Testament and those stories got in front of me again, and we were comparing them book to book and understanding what was really being said, etc., I was making side videos going through, well, this is what Judges actually meant. And here's that weird story from the end of Judges and why it's so sick. Oh, here when we read about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, let me make a side video about that. So expect a lot more New Testament content now that we're putting ourselves in here. But please keep in mind what the goal of secular Bible study is if you feel disappointed that certain things are not being handled. Okay, I think I'm going to be done with caveats for the day. Let's move forward. Also in 5 through 7, it happens very soon. This is where we get the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, things like, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And I want to go ahead and say, hey, a lot of the things that get accredited to Jesus as something that he has said are pretty. Some are insightful. Some are beautiful. Some are profound. Some are stupid. Some are ignorant. Some are wrong, some are harmful, some are hateful. If you're a Christian watching this, you were with me in the first half, and I don't want to deny that half either. If all this was we said, you know what, we're as sure that a character named Jesus existed at this time, and he probably said a lot of these things, and you leave out the miracles, and you leave out the resurrection, and you leave out the bias and the necessity of the ones making this claim to fit him in a supernatural role, and we just say, you know, as far as we know that Plato is real, we know that Jesus was real, and Plato probably said most of these things in most of these ways, and that's also true for Jesus. In as much as I would say, hey, here's what I like about Plato and here's what I don't like, I would say, hey, here's what I like about Jesus's teachings and here's what I didn't like. And it would be nice if we could leave it at that and see him as an influential character in history who might have even been ahead of his time. But since it comes with the baggage of everything else, it does limit people often to just saying, Jesus is a myth in general, or Jesus is all bad. Don't you know he's so hateful and horrible? No, there's some lovely things here, and some of those lovely things come in the Beatitudes. Some of those gross things come in the Beatitudes. But again, that's something we'll just have to look at in its own section. Things really pick up in what I will consider the third section, which is chapters 8 through 10. This is where you get a series of miracles. I think it's 9 different miracles if I've counted them up correctly. Also important to note, during chapters 8 through 10, in addition to the miracles, we get the commissioning of the 12. The apostles are called, they are sent into battle. Here is what it takes to follow Jesus, and he lays it out very clearly. Section 4 is a really interesting collection. I would say it's chapters 11, 12, and 13. We start getting into more of Jesus's mature teachings via his parables. We get understanding of the reactions to Jesus and his teachings. We see from even John the Baptist, who's questioning, to the lowly that are just taking it. Yes, give us more, to the religiously astute at the time that are saying, you blasphemer. Part 5 is going to be 14 through 18. So we get the death of John the Baptist. We get more healings, more miracles. This is where the feeding of the 5,000 happens. This is walking on water. This is Peter's confession. And a really important part, the transfiguration, which happens in chapter 17. I'm so excited to get into all of these side videos. After the transfiguration, it almost seems like those who follow Jesus begin to have more questions as they become more convinced of his divinity. And so we get Jesus's response to that in our 6th section, which I'm going to label chapters 18 through 20. This is where we get the parable of the lost sheep. This is where we get how to forgive, teachings on divorce, let the children come to me. All that stuff happens during this section as Jesus continues to try to reveal who he is as both fully human and fully God, or at least that's the interpretation that we're going to see after the fact on it. Also, this feels like a really important time to point out that there is a hypothetical other source that Matthew and Luke are drawing from called Q. We don't know about it for sure, but it would make sense that there was some document that had some of the teachings and sayings and doings of Jesus that both Matthew and Luke had access to, but not Mark. There's really only 2 more sections when we go through book overview. Part 7 would be chapters 21 through 25, and this is when we start getting into the conflict that happens in Jerusalem. So it starts in 21 with the triumphal entry, as well as the temple cleansing, and these things is where it's starting to come to a head, because we have essentially Jesus allowing, if not outright stating in his own way, his divinity. It's a public assertion of him being the fulfillment of the messianic role, which would also mean his authority over the religious practices at that time. Not good, depending who you are, or if you are the Romans worried about some kind of a coup or uprising. This is also when we start getting some of Jesus's end time predictions and the role of Jerusalem within that. Lastly, part 8 would be the Passion, the death and resurrection, Last Supper, final prayers, arrest, trials, crucifixion, resurrection, all of which happen here in chapters 26 through 28. So hopefully that is a helpful overview of what is contained not only in Matthew, but pretty much in all the other Gospels. As we go through the other Gospels in episodes 41, 42, and 43, I'm hopeful we can really thread out some of these differences and look closely at the personality traits and expectation differences in the character of Jesus and in his surrounding environment and how that reflected both ways. But let's move on to point 2, which is authorship and date. Now, we've talked about this a little bit. Let's start with the traditional authorship idea, which is that Matthew really wrote Matthew. And it is important then to understand why people make this assertion and tie this together. Matthew would have been the tax collector. We see a lot of really good Jewish understanding in Matthew, as well as a pretty heavy focus on money. So those making the traditional claim say, see, that fits when you look at the character of the individual who wrote this. And that is something, that we should talk about. People who like the traditional authorship view often talk about that's how you know it's true, is because each gospel is different. And they take the inconsistencies and outright mutually exclusive claims backwardly as evidence of the truth. That it would be the individual and their personality and their background that would give us a different understanding of who this God was and the lens with which they viewed him in. But it all comes together for one cohesive look. First of all, it does not all come together. One of the first things I did in my deconstruction, which was a challenge put out by, I think it was Ehrman at the time, although I know I've heard it before, was just to go through Jesus's birth, death, and resurrection stories in the four Gospels. Read it for yourself, sit down with a notepad and pen, and write out each detail in a column for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then compare them. Not only are they different in the way that you might get two different testimonials about the same event from two different people while the event itself still maintaining true, they are so different and so mutually exclusive, they simply cannot all be true at the same time. There's a big difference there. So these ideas about the importance of the personalities of the individual gospel writer, it's simply nonsense. It doesn't matter. For something that is supposed to be the most true thing ever recorded and the most important truth ever to be known, we should not have this level of error and inconsistency. The scholarly view, I think, makes a lot more sense, and here are the main tenets of this. The argument is that the author would have been an anonymous, well-educated person writing from one of the main Christian hubs at that time, like Antioch or Syria. These areas were known for their large Jewish population, but also with an influx of recent Gentile conversion. This would reflect well the mixed audience in Matthew. Matthew is structured and composed in a way that does suggest, again, that this author had access to other multiple sources, that being both Mark and the hypothetical Q. And again, getting to the point of well-educated, the vast understanding of the Jewish literature and the law points again to a well-educated Jewish Christian background and not rather some simple Galilean fisherman and tax collector. We could say so much more on these points, but let's move forward here into the time frame aspect. The consensus for the Gospel of Matthew is between 80 and 90 CE, which is based off the relationship to Mark, which predates that. Also, it's important to understand in the dating the destruction of the Second Temple. We know that happened in 70 CE, and it makes way more sense for Matthew's writings about Jesus to be after the knowledge of the destruction of the Second Temple, since we have such a huge emphasis on Jesus being the new temple as he's described here in Matthew. This was helpful. This was an answer to these Jewish Christians who were wrestling with their identity in a post-temple period. And it's really interesting. It's this first transition away from the old. You look at modern Christianity now and anything goes. I don't care if there's a contradiction. I don't care if slavery is represented in the Bible. I don't care about what the old Mosaic or Levitical laws were. Who cares? It's all about Jesus. And essentially, this is what you have Matthew giving these early people who had just lost a lifeline to their religion of what housed all of their previous beliefs. I mean, God used to reside in the temple. Well, no big deal, because God's here now in the form of Jesus. Jesus is the new temple. Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. You can see how it answers these questions. I mean, Matthew is a really transitionary book, and I think that's why, speaking from the canon perspective, it's placed first because it immediately tries to make that connection. Again, when you read it, you will see an agenda of fitting Jesus into this place and time and answering for the Old Testament. Another idea here, just from the scholarly point of view, is, hey, if Matthew was really an eyewitness, why did he need to rely so heavily on Mark, which he clearly did? And also, even to a point of its clarity, the theological sophistication of Matthew is often pointed to a second generation of someone who had deeply thought and considered these teachings of Jesus versus someone who had just witnessed it and wrote it down. There's philosophy at work in Matthew that we wouldn't necessarily expect to see from an eyewitness account that is more trying to record the events that he was witness to. Last part of point 2 here, I think these are going to be longer in general, but especially today's, really stick with me on this, is going to be looking at the manuscript tradition and some of the textual criticisms. I have a very short list for you here. Let's start with understanding our oldest surviving manuscripts for Matthew, which are part of the Chester Beatty Papyri and the Bodmer Papyri. These both date from the 3rd century CE. However, both of these are incomplete, and we don't get our first complete ones until some of the codexes that come out around the 4th century. These would be from the codexes like the Codex Sinaiticus or Codex Vaticanus. We do have textual variations of early Matthew, mainly in parable interpretation, as well as in some of the narrative details. And I know that we're talking about a lot of more scholarly things. And by the way, just my disclaimer for the entire series, I am not a New Testament scholar. I am reporting what I have read and what seems to make the most sense to me and checking it with scholarly consensus on the topics. This isn't some fringe belief. This is pretty standard New Testament scholarship from both believers and non-believers alike. So let's look at Matthew 19:17. We have some manuscripts that say, "Why do you ask me about what is good?" And we have others that say, "Why do you call me good?" This is Jesus talking here. It's subtle, sure, but it's significant, especially when tied into theology at large and the claims that Jesus is making right alongside this. This is about the depiction of Jesus's divinity. What could be more important? Many Christians simply don't know that things like this exist, and this is not a one-off. Some would say they don't care, some would say it doesn't change anything, but I think that when you see enough of them over what is again supposed to be, and well, this is also open for debate, you have many Christians that do not buy into the inerrancy of the Bible. But if any part of the Bible should be trustworthy, should it not be in the gospel accounts about who our God is, how he saved us, and how we receive his gift of salvation? Again, I get saying, well, it's just fallible men and men make mistakes and all of that excuse the condition of the Bible as we have it. But at some point, you have to believe some of it, right? And my point is, if there's problems with some of it, how do you believe any of it? And that may sound like a black or white fallacy, but when you're talking about total truth claims, I think it's a totally fair critique. Let's leave point 2 behind and move into point 3, which is historical context and background and accuracy. It's important to understand that Matthew is primarily set in Galilee and Judea in the 1st century CE. This is at a time where these are completely under Roman rule. And there is a lot of social unrest and religious tension and various different, again, Jewish sects that are trying to figure out the best way to move forward within that. Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, Zealots. There's a really interesting book that makes the case for Jesus just being the ultimate zealot. I think it's called Zealot by Reza Aslan, if you wanted to check that out. But it's interesting to try to put Jesus in this time and place and understand how the historical Jesus, if he were really doing and saying the things he is claimed to have been doing and saying, would have viewed himself. And Zealot seems to fit the category quite nicely. After all, you have him challenging both institutions, the spiritual Jewish institution of leadership and the Roman governmental rule. This story, if true, even to this degree, before you get into miracles and resurrections, is kind of neat to see this historical figure cropping up and fighting the man, if you will. And of course, many parts of this story are verifiable and true. We have Pontius Pilate, who plays a significant role in the trial and sentencing of Jesus. We have Herod Antipas, who is the local ruler in Galilee. We understand their positions. We have historical documentation of their positions, yet alone the histories that are written about them. Herod the Great gets quite the write-up, more attention than I think anybody else from the historian Josephus. That's a lot of what I based my video on the murder of the innocents about. Check that out if you want to see some of the great detail that you can go into just a few of these verses in Matthew. But the massacre of the innocents, as it is typically known, is a great distinction between the parts that we know about, like some of these historical Roman figureheads, against the parts that are claimed within the accounts of the Gospels, and the mix match of truth that happened there. There are so many good reasons to believe that that massacre simply did not happen, and that it is actually just a justification for two things. One, to get Jesus to go where he needed to go to fulfill some prophecies, and two, to connect this theme that Matthew has of trying to make Jesus the new Moses, 40 days in the wilderness, giving his law from a mountaintop, coming out of Egypt, etc. There's a whole lot here that, again, you see the agenda really clear when you have a good understanding of the Old Testament and you're willing to read plainly what is being spoken about here in the New. Then you get things that, of course, it's impossible to have any archaeological evidence for or anything like this. Think about Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. What evidence could we possibly have for that? We do see that it reflects some of the Jewish wisdom teaching of the day. In fact, a lot of it is kind of within the same slave mentality that you expect from a people group that has been beaten down and subjugated by both their God and their enemies. The meek will inherit the earth. That's a revenge story. The last shall become first, etc. So speaking of archaeological findings, we don't have a lot for Matthew. We do have some early synagogue and even, they say, Peter's house from Capernaum, which was kind of like Jesus's home base at this time. We have the Pilate stone, which helps us corroborate the identity and validity of, again, the Pontius Pilate character. And again, an absence of evidence is not the same thing as no evidence. There doesn't have to be evidence for these things to have actually happened, but in just talking about what we can know, again, kind of the point of a secular Bible study series, these are really the only archaeological evidences that we have. So yes, Matthew is grounded in some historical landscapes in terms of understanding well the Jewish tradition, law, the religious tensions, and the societal impact of Roman rule, for sure. But it should be viewed 100% for its theological bias and approach and motives. With that said, let's move into point 4, which is literary analysis. The first part of the structural composition that I want to talk about here is discourse. We have 5 major discourses in the book of Matthew. That's a unique literary technique that we have not seen as much of. We've seen some for sure in the Old Testament, but we're about to see a whole lot more in the next 4 books. We have first the Sermon on the Mount. Then we have the missionary discourse, which comes in chapter 10. Sermon on the Mount is 5 through 7. We have a collection of parables, also known as the parable discourse in chapter 13, the community discourse of chapter 18, and the most importantly eschatological discourse in chapters 24 through 25. The end times, the coming of the Son of Man, the final judgment, etc. In terms of literary features, we're laden with parables, first and foremost. That is something that is so unique to the New Testament, specifically to the Gospels. And it's something I actually like a lot about Jesus. Same thing I like about a lot of other philosophers of their day. I'm a sucker for a good analogy. Put it in story form. Show it to me. Help me understand it from a different perspective. What's so funny is how often Jesus's followers simply do not understand what he is trying to say by the parable, which leads to them questioning, which leads Jesus just to simply monologue or diatribe on it, and we kind of get a discourse after the fact. I think it'd be more powerful if it was just left mainly to parable, but it would also leave it more open to interpretation, which Lord knows we have enough of already. Genealogies, again, very important to the Gospels and specifically to the book of Matthew. Fulfillment citations is a lot. This again is where you see the agenda and the motive of the author of Matthew. He will come out and straight up say, this, what I've just written, is to fulfill what was said here, and point to something in the Old Testament. Again, Matthew was clearly building a case to connect the two. There's a lot of instructive narrative. There's a lot of dramatic element to it. I mean, this is one of the greatest stories ever told. It's not the first to tell this kind of story, by the way, but the influence from the story about a God lowering himself to become one of us, to go through what humans had to go through to a point, and to die, and die horrifically at that, as a sacrifice for the people that he chose to become like, that he also created, to save us, even if it's to save us from the thing that he created, and then to create perfect utopia against a perfect hell, is quite the story. It was never going to be on the sideline. This is the leading feature of the New Testament. Without it, Paul has nothing. Speaking of which, let's move on to point 5, main themes. This probably doesn't need to be said, so I'll move quickly. First one that might surprise you is going to be the kingdom of heaven. This is something that needed to be established. We have references that are vague in the Old Testament, but the ushering in of the term and conceptualization of kingdom of heaven is something wholly specific to the Gospels, and again, really highlighted within Matthew. It is portrayed as a present reality and a future potentiality. That is a dualistic nature of it that is very unique and something that Jesus really had to beat home to these people and help them understand. Righteousness, I think, would be the second main theme. A higher moral standard. Again, some really beautiful moral standards as well. Love is something that is preached in Matthew by this Jesus. I think there's some really negative byproducts of it, as I've covered in Commanded to Love, where first and foremost, we are called to love God above everything else. And we know that to love God is to obey God, and obeying God to the fullest is actually quite harmful. And so it's not as simple and sweet sounding as it is, but loving your neighbor as yourself, that's wonderful. It's a shame that what Jesus meant by neighbor was Jew to Jew, and wasn't as all-inclusive as people like to describe it. I'm not trying to point you to too many videos, but watch my video on the Gentiles so you can get an understanding of this, because I think that there is this concept of the modern average Christian who thinks, you know what, the Old Testament, it's for the Jews, right? God's working within a chosen people group. He has his reasons. His ways are higher. We see their law. We're not bound by that law. We're under a new covenant. Our covenant came with Jesus. We don't know why God had to act the way he did in the Old Testament, but again, he had his reasons, and it was all because he needed to get this line to produce Jesus. But now we have Jesus, and Jesus opens the gateway, and we live over here, except that's not what is said by Jesus. It is something that is definitely twisted and spun by Paul, and further twisted and spun by Christianity as it morphs and evolves over the centuries. But reading the words of Jesus, you do not get this. Just something I think we should be considerate of as we move through a lot of these verses. So that would be a third main theme, a new interpretation of the law. New interpretation seems like the wrong word for a God of immutability, but whatever. Point 4 would be Jesus as the Messiah. This has to be a huge theme of any gospel message. This is the case that has to be shown to be true. And again, to great effect does the author of Matthew do this. Point 6 here almost feels silly to talk about the reception and influence of Matthew. Christianity and everything that entails. If you don't have Jesus and his life and his death and his resurrection, you don't have Christianity. Honestly, I'm not trying to reduce this. I am going to skip over this point for at least today. Maybe we can talk about the Gospels in general at the end and the influence that they have had in so many facets, both good and bad. Tons of good. I'm not denying it. I just think we're going to do it a disservice if we actually try to talk about it in today's video. So let's move on to point 7, where we have a lot of work to be done with contradictions and problematic passages. Let's start with contradictions, and I'm not going to be able to give you every single one. You can go look up contradictions in Matthew. I'm going to highlight some that I think are of more importance. By the way, I'm not saying there's not some answers given from the Christian apologist side to these issues, but I think that even with the answers given, they're still worth pointing out, and in many cases, those answers absolutely fall short. The first one that we're going to talk about is Jesus's lineage. It's right off the bat. Matthew tries to make the connection through Joseph, which aims to establish Jesus's legal right to the throne. This is in almost direct opposition to how Luke does it. Luke goes through a different son, Nathan, which some have said is actually through Mary's line, and others have said is just from a different branch within the line of Joseph. But either way, this is an issue. Again, I'm not going to explain all the fine points of everything. I'm just going to lay them out there for you. Let's talk about the birth and infancy narratives next. And a lot of this is going to be Matthew versus Luke, because John doesn't cover a lot or goes off the deep end. We'll get to that when we get to John. And again, Mark is doing his own thing that both Matthew and Luke are borrowing from and then sometimes changing. So it's going to get messy. So Matthew has the Magi, the flight into Egypt, the massacre of the innocents, none of which, by the way, Luke has. Now, this is going to be the case for many contradictions. Well, Brandon, that's not fair. Just because another eyewitness or anonymous gospel writer chose not to include some of the same details doesn't mean they didn't happen. Agreed. But when you get different stories, like Luke has different stories that Matthew doesn't cover, and then both of those stories can't be true at the same time. It's not just the loss of a story, it's the addition of another one that makes it hard to bear. For instance, Luke instead covers the census of Caesar Augustus, something else we don't have good historical support for, along with the visit of the shepherds and Jesus' appearance in the temple, which is going to be really hard to do when you have fled to Egypt. Again, I have heard the apologist and how, well, okay, he was presented in the temple later, like at a different age, and yes, it wouldn't have been the norm, but it's what would have had to be done considering the risk in the flight to Egypt. And it's just too much mental gymnastics to try to make a bunch of things that otherwise clearly don't fit together fit together. In the briefest possible terms, the resurrection differences between all four Gospels, again, go through on your own. But Matthew 28 versus Mark 16 versus Luke 24 and John 20 and 21. But we're talking about Matthew. Matthew specifically mentions an earthquake and one angel whose appearance was like lightning that rolled back the stone. There's your lead off. Go see what is said in the other three accounts. Hint, it's not the same. Another thing that's going to be funny to point out is when you get preferential ideas between different gospel accounts. Sermon on the Mount is the perfect example. Everyone knows about the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5 through 7. How many of you know about Luke's Sermon on the Plain? It's the same event. They just take place in different places. And Matthew is this long, beautiful discourse, and Luke's is much shorter, and it's fine if it's just a recap. Again, that's a perfect example of how two different people who were both eyewitnesses might have recorded the same thing differently. But now we've got different locations as well. I don't know. And thinking of that, going back again to the geographical inaccuracies, let's talk about Matthew. Matthew implies that Mary and Joseph lived in Bethlehem and then later went to Nazareth after returning from Egypt. However, Luke presents Nazareth as the original home all the way through. In his case, only going to Bethlehem for the census. What really gets interesting is when you look at the Old Testament site fulfillments they're trying to make here. You need him to be a Nazarene, but also from Bethlehem, but also out of Egypt. That's a whole lot of work for one person's birth story. And they both came up with different reasons to get him to Bethlehem, and only Matthew came up with a reason to get him to Egypt. Isn't that interesting? Which leads to the historical inaccuracies as well. Again, I'm talking about Luke here, but this entire census is obviously a plot device to get them to Bethlehem. It's not mentioned in Matthew, and it's not historically accurate, period. Even issues with the apocalyptic predictions, which is already vague, but you get parts like in Matthew 24 where Jesus predicts when the end will come, and it simply didn't happen. And the goalpost has been moved ever since and continues to get moved. And I haven't been reading all the verses because we have so much to go through, but for this one, Matthew 24:34, truly I say to you, this generation, the one he's speaking to, will not pass away until all these things take place. In context of what he's talking about and what the apostles are asking him about, it is crystal clear Jesus thought the second coming was happening in the next few decades, and it didn't. Okay, let's speed this up though. We're going to put the Bible aside. I made a big list in bed the other night. This is not nearly all of them, but here we go. I'll let you look them up for yourselves. We have not talked about Judas's death, which we get two different ones. In Matthew 27, we get that he hanged himself and he threw the silver pieces into the temple, but that's not what we get in Acts when he fell headlong and his body burst open and something else occurred with the money and the blood field, etc. And no, you cannot reconcile them as he was hanged and then fell down and exploded and fell down in this specific field that he otherwise hadn't had. No. What about the timing of the Last Supper? In Matthew 26:17 through 19, it's a Passover meal, but John suggests that it occurred before Passover in John 13:1. What about the resurrection appearance? Matthew's account from Matthew 28:16 through 20 has him appearing in Galilee, which differs in setting from Luke's account, which centers around Jerusalem. That's Luke 24. Jesus' anointing looks different too. In Matthew, a woman anoints Jesus at Bethany during the last week of his life. That's Matthew 26:6 through 13. But John places the event much earlier and identifies the woman as Mary. John 12:1 through 8. Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. Matthew mentions two animals, a donkey and a colt, involved in the triumphal entry. That's Matthew 21:2 through 7. But Mark and Luke mention only one colt. That's Mark 11 and Luke 19. The centurion's servant is another one. In Matthew 8, Matthew describes the centurion coming to Jesus, but in Luke, it's mentioned that the centurion sent elders of the Jews to speak on his behalf. Now, you could say, Brandon, that doesn't matter. All that matters is that Jesus died and was resurrected. Who cares if the centurion went himself or had elders go for him? The truth cares. Only one of these things can be true, and this is a silly little hill to die on, but what about when you put 90 of them together? What about when they're just simply not reliable? Why then take the craziest claim of all of them that this man resurrected as the Son of God after defeating death and sin and saying that's the one we can be sure of? That's why I think these things matter, and I'm going to read as many as I'm going to read, even though it's not a full accounting, and I'm going to speed it up still. We get differences in Jesus' temptation between Matthew 4 and Luke 4. 2 blind men versus 1 in Matthew 20 versus Mark 10 and Luke 18. Not quite a contradiction, but only in Matthew do we get all of Joseph's dreams. There's a few different accounts, and they work as great plot devices, or I should say exposition, that we don't get in other Gospels. We have a different number of Beatitudes between Matthew and Luke. When Jesus talks about divorce in Matthew, he gives the except for sexual immorality clause, which is not given in Mark or Luke. The healing of Jairus' daughter in Matthew, she's already dead, but in Mark and Luke, she was dying, not yet dead. Pretty big difference. The cleansing of the temple in Matthew happens immediately after the triumphal entry, but Mark implies it happened the day after in Mark 11. How the first disciples are called, the coin in the fish's mouth, the Canaanite woman's faith, the questioning of John the Baptist, the death of John the Baptist, Jesus walking on water, the transfiguration, Jesus' teaching on oaths, the leaven of the Pharisees, the number of angels at the tomb, the teaching on forgiveness, the feeding of the multitudes, the teaching on retaliation, the ascension, Jesus' silence before his accusers, teaching about the end times, all different between Matthew and another account. Okay, so you know what? Actually, I was going to read off like another 40 in that rapid style. I think that it's less meaningful if we don't take the time to go chapter by verse and show exactly what is being said. So I'm going to limit it to just a few more. And these ones I want you to see Jesus's personality. It's not a direct conflict because people are multifaceted. That's fine. But these personalities of Jesus are consistent throughout these different books in their different ways. It's like the author of the Anonymous Gospel, as they continue with the evolution of Jesus, is trying to get them in their responses to represent a different message or part of the story. So let me give an example. How about how Jesus responds to Peter's sword use? Well, in Matthew 26:52, Jesus rebukes Peter for using a sword in Gethsemane. He states, all who take the sword will perish by the sword, okay? But in John 18:11, Jesus just tells Peter to put it away and says something completely different. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? Huge different implications for Jesus's actions here. In Luke 22:51, now we include the healing of the servant's ear by Jesus. That part is absent in Matthew, which again paints Jesus in this very different kind of light. And Mark does not include any of Jesus's commentary on the sword, only focusing on the arrest. This is a perfect example. You could technically say all these things are true. None of them contradict. Maybe he said multiple things. But again, when trying to show us the truth of something happening and who this God is, we have a very different case being made. We can also see it in Jesus' interaction with Pilate. In Matthew 27:11 through 14, we have a brief interaction where Jesus answers, "You have said so," when asked if he is king of the Jews. But in John, we get a very detailed theological discussion between Jesus and Pilate about kingship and truth. Like, John is the one who's going to take most of it to the extreme. But then in Mark 15 and Luke 23, we also mention the interaction, but with less detail than John, but still different than what is stated in Matthew. I don't know if it's seen anywhere as starkly as it is with Jesus's final cry from the cross. In Matthew 27 and in Mark 15, both report Jesus crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Well, Luke doesn't like this, and we get in Luke 23:46, Jesus saying, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And of course, with John 19:30, takes it in a new direction with the last words, "It is finished." This is completely different. One is Jesus's abandonment, one is Jesus's fulfillment, and one is Jesus's mission. Like, this is just not cohesive, no matter how you want to string it up. Again, I'd encourage you to take the time, and I know it's redundant, and that's why most of us have not noticed these things until you do the practice, but sit down and just read the 4 Gospels. Take an afternoon. Write it all out. You will find so much. You will also find that there are many contradictions that have been tried to be established by atheists or skeptics that do have good answers, that do make sense in the context of what is trying to be highlighted or shown. I've tried to be pretty careful with my own here. But let's move on to the last thing I want to do, which is problematic passages. I don't know how this is going to go. My plan, I didn't mark anything down, is just to look at the chapters and see what comes to mind to talk to you about. I'll be more detailed next time if I need to be. I'm also going to try not to repeat myself because luckily I think we did cover a lot of ground. And the first thing that comes to mind here is the temptation of Jesus that we get in Matthew chapter 4. Christians like to say Jesus was both fully God and fully man, but he really swings back and forth between when he is bound by his human nature and when he is able to do supernatural things as a deity. Should we give Jesus credit for being tempted by Satan when he is God And he knows that in a very short while at this point, he will be God again with God the Father ruling over the universe and winning in the end. Does the devil offering him the kingdoms of man mean anything at all? Christians love to say Jesus was tempted in every way we were tempted. He knows. That's why he came to earth, to beat every sin. No, he doesn't. He never had children. He was never married. He never had to face old age. He never had to have a question mark, no matter what his faith said about, is he right? Is he deceived? I could go on forever. In no way did Jesus experience all the temptations. And when we get examples about him being hungry and being tempted by bread, or showing off his power by falling and having the angels catch him, or again, ruling the kingdoms of man, they're meaningless. And yet, the Christian hangs so much upon Jesus being tempted and being perfect that he had to be perfect for his sacrifice to count. I said this the other day, but if the only person in the history of time who has ever been able to be perfect just so happens to be God, what does that mean? It just means that God chose to make everyone except himself fallible. Moving forward to chapter 5, and I'm skipping so much. I want to talk about the Beatitudes, but I'm going to save it. When Jesus starts talking about anger, he says in verse 22, "But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment." This is one of the first instances of thought crime in the New Testament. Just being angry, which I think everyone except Jesus has had, makes you guilty of murder. Same thing with being lustful and being guilty of an affair. This extrapolation of unacted upon sin, if you can even call it that, is truly insane. It's an impossible measure to live up to, and it's not helpful. It just leaves people riddled with fear, guilt, and shame. This is not one of the beautiful parts that I see of the gospel message. Gosh, I just find myself wanting to talk about each of these. The next sections are lust, divorce, oaths, and retaliation, all of which are problematic, but let's move on to something else. The call to love your enemies is extremely problematic. It opens one up for all kinds of abuse. It's also completely hypocritical because God says he hates his enemies, period. God does not forgive his enemies. He condemns them to death or hell. The very fact, and it's within here as well, within forgiveness, that we are called to forgive no matter what, all the time, just as is, when God does not forgive all the time and requires certain things for forgiveness to happen, including blood sacrifice, child sacrifice from this incredibly pagan ritual of blood magic, is insane. When God loves Satan, I'll love my enemy. And you can say, who am I to judge God and all of that nonsense? But the very fact that we have a creator who gives us rules that he is completely incapable of following is incredibly problematic. In chapter 8, we start getting into the cost of following Jesus as he prepares his disciples, and this is when the great persecution complex comes into play. Jesus promises those who follow him that they will be persecuted, and he prepares them by saying horrific things, like in verse 21, another of the disciples said to him, "Lord, let me go first and bury my father." And Jesus said to him, "Follow me and leave the dead to bury their own." Many people like to tell me that I'm taking these verses out of context and Jesus is just being hyperbolic, but a verse like this shows he meant it. No, don't go bury your father. That doesn't matter. I matter. Leave your wife. Leave your children. Deny yourself. Die to yourself. I talked on Sunday about the slave mentality of Christianity, and I think it starts right here. We could talk about that a lot more, but I'm trying to be brief. A really interesting verse that Christians seem to like to ignore comes from 10:34. "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother. Whoever loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." It immediately follows up with talk about rewards for losing your life for Christ. That's not love. That's not a God of peace. It says it. This idea of meek and mild Jesus is ridiculous. He was a zealot. He came. He thought of himself as the Jewish Messiah. He just lost. He was arrested, beaten, and murdered. And so we simply had to reframe him in a way that was not at all what he thought of himself or what the Old Testament would have revealed him to be. He failed. Another thing that's catching my eye right now is chapter 11, verses 20. This is a section titled, "Woe to the Unrepentant Cities. I tell you that it will be more tolerable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom than for you." This is after he chastises a a whole list of cities. This is collective punishment. It is something I think doesn't get enough attention, and it is something that people typically only attribute to the God of the Old Testament. We have Jesus doing the same thing here. Collective punishment is the definition of unjust. The idea that an entire city is guilty of a penalty worse than that of Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, we already know this God thinks this way. Look, he flooded the whole earth. He destroys whole cities at a time, whole generations, whole tribes. But the reality is that there's just no way there's not innocent people there. Even if the only thing you can think of to be innocent would be children, there's children. That's not love, that's not mercy, that's not peace, that's not understanding, that's not justice. That's wrath, that's vengeance, that's anger, that's hatred. I've talked about this one a lot, so I'm going to be very brief, but if we move all the way to 1521, we get the story of the Canaanite woman, whose daughter is oppressed by a demon. By the way, one of the main things I could point out here is the way that Jesus talks about demon possession when it's clearly just people being sick, even mentally sick. And Jesus couldn't recognize that. He was under the superstitions of his day, which was demonic possession. But here we have a Canaanite woman whose daughter has been oppressed by a demon. And at first we get this, but he did not answer her a word. So he completely ignores her. And the disciples came and begged him, saying, "Send her away. She is crying after us." What an inconvenience for them. He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." So we have him clearly saying why he ignored her. He's not here for her. If you need a more clear message than this, that this Jesus came just to redeem the Jewish people, you're not going to get it. But she persists. She came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered, "It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." So the Jews are the children's because Jesus has placed himself in spiritual authority over them, and even lesser than the children, which didn't have good status, by the way. This isn't a compliment to the Jews. This term would have obviously been incredibly derogatory for the Gentile. This is just pure and blatant racism. And so like Job, look what this woman has to do to get the Lord to let up. She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "O woman, great is your faith. Be it done then as you desire." And her daughter was healed instantly. So I want to point out a few things, because most of the time when people recount the story, if they're Christian, they say, "Oh, it was a test. He was just testing her faith, and then he rewarded her faith." Was it not already clear that she was faithful? She obviously believed that Jesus was capable of healing her daughter. She persisted a few times while being ignored and spoken down to and criticized. And only once she criticized herself and made a smart quip about how even dogs get something, Jesus, entertained by her, snapped his magic fingers and instantly healed her daughter, something it would have taken nothing from him to do the first time that she showed her faith, or the second. This is not a test. This is not a pretty story. This is clear as day who this Jesus thought of himself as. A master, even over the Jews, and not here for the Gentiles, those dogs. Not worth his response. This to me is honestly one of the sickest stories in the entire Bible, and that's saying a lot, and that's why you've probably heard me say it, but I really want you to understand it. In 18, we get some more hyperbole, to put it best, from Jesus. "If your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life, crippled or lame, than with 2 hands or 2 feet to be thrown into the eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than with 2 eyes to be thrown into the hell of fire." Now, I don't want to get into the whole annihilation versus hell, and I could be sold on either way, but either way, it doesn't matter, because Jesus is not talking in a parable yet. He'll start his parable immediately afterwards. He is literally saying that the most important thing is obedience. And if something is in the way, even if we're talking hyperbolically here, get rid of it. And we know that he believes things like your family or attending your father's funeral or your daughter can get in your way. Jesus was an extremist. You can water it down all you want, but all he cares about is blind and total obedience. It's very, very clear. Also, I'm skipping over a ton of parables where Jesus talks about the proper form of a servant or slave. Never once, by the way, even in the hypothetical form of a parable, does he condemn slavery. He accepts it as part of the culture. He does not condemn it in any fashion. In fact, he instructs slaves on how to properly act. perfect. That's Matthew. I hope that this wasn't too fragmented. Let me know if you do have suggestions for what you'd like to hear more of, or kind critiques of how you think I should be addressing the New Testament. But in general, I still like going through these 7 points. I think that we've done a good job covering the differences between the Gospels. I think that we've pointed out the mutually exclusive parts, the inconsistencies, the contradictions, the authorship issues, and are hopefully starting to show even the New Testament, which people think is all just love, kittens, and rainbows, as a continuation of some really horrific concepts that were not able to be fully detached from the God of the Old Testament. And where they are detached, at best, all you can say is you have a contradiction in character between God the Father and God the Son, which for a perfect Holy Trinity that has been together since before time, this seems to be incredibly problematic. So you choose the Old Testament versus the New Testament contradiction, or the Old Testament God is the same as the New Testament God, in which case Jesus is not and cannot be what you want him to be. This is it for today. I'm very excited to be doing this. Thank you to everyone that is following along. I cannot wait for the next 26 books. And until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast and Boris GVI, Jacob, Joe, Martin, Oliver, Perry, Rokkit, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes Jarrod, James, and Kristi, my Atheist advocates Caleb, Imposter, Jeff, Jeffrey, Karen, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of the channel or you just enjoy the content, please consider joining these fine people. Thanks and have a great day.